Hello everyone, welcome back to the show. My name's Dan, this is Exploder, and I'm here with another episode just for you. I say that every time, and every time it's still true. In this episode, I want to talk about a particular thing that happened in the early 2000s, and it's a group that's very similar to another group you may know. Do you remember the Nexus? Now, of course, at the end they got superseded and made irrelevant, and David Otunga being involved was never good, and Curtis Axel and a lot of other things. But the point is, at one point the Nexus at the beginning was a really hot angle. NXT, of course, was the beginning, the first season of NXT, back when it was a reality show, kinda, replaced ECW, thank God. The original 7 guys who were on that show made a group, well, original 8 actually, now that I come to think of it, but the original 8 guys made a group, and they attacked and they tore the ring down, and they choked out an announcer with his tie, which apparently was too far, and things like that. But everyone remembers that initial angle of the Nexus. What if I told you, for wrestling fans that are sort of coming a little later to the game, what if I told you there was someone who'd done that before them? Not only before them, but a decade before. So in this episode, I'm not going to talk about the Nexus. No, I'm going to talk about what some might consider the original Nexus, the Natural Born Thrillers. The Natural Born Thrillers was a group comprised of 7 power plant trainees who came out of the power plant in Smyrna, Georgia, which was the head trainer was a guy named Dwayne Bruce, Sarge, Buddy Lee Parker, Braun the Leprechaun, that's a real thing, and but they were mainly trained by Paul Orndorff, the guy who could beat the crap out of Vader in sandals. So that's a good guy to learn from. The group was comprised of numerous people, and I'll bring it up, but the one thing they had in common is they all went to the power plant, and they all came on TV. Now, the power plant produced exactly 2 stars the entire time it was there, and those 2 stars were Diamond Dallas Page and Goldberg. That's it. There were guys who came out of the power plant, but none of them would reach those levels. That said, there are these members of the Natural Born Thrillers, what happened to them, and this is how they came to be. So I want to go a little bit over their history and just let you know what happened to them, how they became a group, their impact on WCW and wrestling in general, and then the aftermath, what happened after the fact. The whole group started and formed in August of 2000. Now, at this time, Vince Russo is firmly in charge after basically giving Hogan a chance to leave and then sue them. That was a great plan. Bischoff's gone because Hogan's gone. Hogan's gone because Vince Russo's an asshole. And at this point, WCW gave Vince Russo full creative control over everything. Now, remind you, the year 2000 for WCW was a nightmare of a train wreck of a cluster. I can't even properly explain it. That's the background. During this time, he decided he was going to push a lot of young guys. Well, let's back up a little bit before this is formed, before the group itself is formed. The group was formed in August of 2000, but let's back up a little bit. The idea behind these guys was that WCW were bringing in young guys, the New Blood storyline that, again, if I get a chance, I'm going to do a whole episode just on the New Blood, because that's very interesting and how it sort of had a good idea and then it just fell apart because, you know, WCW. But around that time, there were guys who came in and they were young guys. And like I said, all these guys were power plant trainees, so they weren't established guys like Hogan and Nash and Randy Savage and all these guys. These were guys who were coming off, some of them sort of off the street, and in the case of some of them who actually had runs with WWE before, but were getting another chance in WCW and actually got over a little bit. During the New Blood storyline, the Vince Russo behind the scenes and Eric Bischoff on screen got the idea that they were going to create new versions of older stars. So that's when you saw guys like Chuck Palumbo being the new version of Lex Luger as the event Chuck Palumbo, or Sean Stasiak, of course, being the new version of Kurt Hennig, but they couldn't use Mr. Perfect, but he was, and I'll get into what they called him. So that was really the beginning of this. It was before they actually formed the group, but the idea was there with the New Blood storyline. The group itself, like I said, was formed in August of 2000, and they would last up until early 2001 when the group broke apart over infighting. Every member of the group was picked up when WCW was purchased by WWE in March of 2001, and I'll explain exactly what happened to each individual as time went on, and everyone had sort of a different, varied success rate in wrestling and outside of it, which I think is really interesting in itself. During their time in WCW as a group, they would do numerous things, from Mike Sanders, who I'll get to, being the commissioner, the on-screen commissioner, because like I said, at some point, everyone got a chance at being commissioner. Palumbo and Stasiak would win the tag team titles twice. Palumbo and OHair would win the tag team titles once. Mike Sanders would win the Cruiserweight title. They would be a major force in WCW storylines for a couple months there, which is really impressive when you think about the fact that these are all rookies who had only been in the company at that point less than a year. Many of them had wrestled before for WCW as like job work, and during some of the early New Blood stuff, guys like Mike Sanders was actually doing security work. He was part of R&B security and things like that, and you'll see a young Chris Harris, a young James Storm, a young this and that, but not that the other two are actually in the Natural Born Thrillers, but you see what I'm saying? Like, they were background work, and then they decided to bring him on as a wrestler. More scandalous than Ted DiBiase's tax forms, it's Newsflash. Despite defeating NXT on a weekly basis, AEW's ratings have also begun to fall. Turns out there's only so much of a shit you can give about Chris Jericho. WWE recently returned to Saudi Arabia for the Crown Jewel event that saw a boxer with a wrestling name win by countout, Brock Lesnar kill some MMA guy, and Ric Flair having to spend 24 whole hours without getting laid. The Fiend won the Universal title at Crown Jewel in a move.
Let me in.
What the hell was that? Former WWE Tag Team Champion and Face Explosion survivor Joey Mercury recently quit Ring of Honor, blasting his bosses on the way out. This comes as a surprise to most people because they forgot Ring of Honor was still around. Austin Aries still hasn't burned any bridges in MLW, but there's still time. That's it for Newsflash. Let's get back to the show. Now let's talk about the actual members of the Natural Born Thrillers, starting with the event, Chuck Palumbo. Chuck Palumbo wrestled around the independents for a while. I remember seeing him in a magazine where he was wrestled as Triple A, like his name was Triple A. I don't know, not sure why. He would wrestle in WCW under the name Jungle Jim, J-I-M, because he had long curly hair. I don't know. He made his WCW debut on a Nitro in October of 1998 as a fan who accepted the challenge of Ernest the Cat Miller. And in mid-2000, like I said, he was brought on to be the new Lex Luger. And he was given the name The Event, in which he feuded with Luger, which was exciting as it sounds. Meh. He would then join up with Shawn Stasiak to create the team The Perfect Event, and like I said, they'd win the tag team titles twice during 2000 because it was 2000 and that's how things went back then, before Palumbo would leave Stasiak and join up with Sean O'Haire in sort of a mixed match tag team, and they would win the tag team titles, and they would defend them against Lance Storm and Mike Awesome on the last Nitro, successfully I might add, and they would go into Invasion as the WCW Tag Team Champions against the WWF Tag Team Champions at the time, the APA. I'm sure that was fun. Palumbo and O'Haire would lose the tag team titles to the Brothers of Destruction because that's how it was done back then, and Palumbo himself was actually repackaged a few times after the Invasion, and this is not disputable here. The highest point of his career was a part of the gay but not really team of Billy and Chuck that involved them having a commitment ceremony on air on SmackDown that everyone took seriously until right before they got married, I guess, and then they both admitted they weren't gay and then got beat up by two large Samoan men. Again, this all really happened. Then he came back as a full-blooded Italian with former Natural Born Thrillers teammate Johnny the Bull Stamboli, and believe me, I'll get to him, as well as Nunzio. And then he left and went to the Independents, and then he came back, and then he was a biker who was sort of, it's true to his life, and I'll explain why, but the thing about it was he came off as like a second-rate biker Undertaker, and we already had that. They were called the Disciples of Apocalypse. Look him up. He retired from wrestling in 2012, and now, unsurprisingly, runs his own custom bike shop, CP Customs. Opened a gym, played in a band called Three Spoke Wheel, and in 2014 hosted Rusted Development on the Discovery Channel, a show about fixing and customizing cars and motorcycles at Slam Garage, another business he owns. Not only that, in addition to all that, in 2016, he saved a woman's life by lifting a car off of her. So yeah, he's a former pro wrestler and current superhero. Then you move on to Shawn Stasiak. Shawn Stasiak is unique to the whole group. Everyone else here was sort of, they had an independent career and then they went to the power plant, or they sometimes, in the case of one I'm going to mention later, sort of came off the street, so to speak. Shawn Stasiak is a little different because he had a career before this. He had signed with WWE in a developmental in 1997, had appeared on their television a few times as both a jobber and then eventually as, and I'm not joking here, Meat, the, I assume, meat-covered plaything of PMS, Pretty Mean Sisters, thank you Russo, and once wrestled an entire match with a simulated boner. I can't believe I just said that sentence, but it was the Attitude Era, so of course I did. So when he came to WCW to train in the power plant, Shawn Stasiak, unlike everyone else, had already worked in the national market, I guess the way to put it. He had already worked nationally for WWF. He had been fired by WWF for recording a conversation between two guys he shouldn't have, and he said it was a joke, and they fired for it anyway, so ha ha ha. So he'd already come into this after being on national television, but, he was Shawn Stasiak, so, He trained at the power plant under Paul Orndorff, like I mentioned, and he debuted on Nitro in April of 2000, immediately attacking Curt Hennig. Like I said, Shawn Stasiak would be the new version of Curt Hennig, but again, they couldn't call him Mr. Perfect because that's the WWF trademark, so they would make allusions to him being like Curt Hennig and then call him things like the Perfect One. And then when I realized how stupid that sounded, they changed it to Perfection. You heard me, Perfection. His name's Shawn Stasiak. Get it? WCW. As I mentioned, won the tag titles with Chuck Palumbo twice in 2000, because of course. And then when WCW was sold, his contract was picked up for some reason, and he was part of the Alliance, and like a lot of the guys I'm mentioning here, he was kept in the Alliance, but they played him off as like a goofball who couldn't do anything right. And famously, when they had a Steve Austin Appreciation Night, when everyone was showing their tribute videos and how they thought Steve Austin was so great and all these things, they just showed Shawn Stasiak constantly messing up his lines, constantly getting it wrong, and they turned it into like a character, where the reality was that was actually the footage. It wasn't a character. He wasn't playing a goofball who kept screwing up. He was actually a goofball kept screwing up. So they were just using real life and making it into a character. They had him do a lot of slapstick, running into walls, and suits of armor and all these different things. It was just a way to play off the fact that he was goofy. He never had a lot of charisma. He never had a lot of ability. He was efficient in the ring, but then again, so was Scott Putski. You remember Scott Putski? Of course you don't. Point is, just being the son of a former WWF champion like he was, his father, Stan Stasiak, just because you're that doesn't mean you're going to be a superstar. So anyway, after the goof character, then they had him come back and he was a crazy person from Planet Stasiak. Wherever the hell that is, it's somewhere between parts unknown and I don't know. I wish I could find something clever to say there, but I don't think it deserves it. He requests his release in late September 2002, and then he left to become a chiropractor, because that's what you do. He's a chiropractor, a motivational speaker, things like that. And then I remember a couple years ago, he did this weird video where he was, I don't know if it was part of his motivational speaking thing, but he was going to return to wrestling and win the WWE title, because that would be the first case of a father and son holding the same WWE title, which would be cool if the son wasn't Shawn Stasiak. But nothing came of it. He did a video, I'm going to do a thing, and it's going to be this big motivational thing, and then he just didn't do it. And he just stayed a motivational speaker and chiropractor. So, alright. Let's move on to above average Mike Sanders. Yes, you heard that nickname right. Above average. Like I said about Mike Sanders, he actually debuted for WCW in October of 1998 on WCW Saturday Night, losing to Chavo Guerrero, and would not really appear until 2000 when they brought him in for the Natural Born Thrillers angle. August 16, 2000, episode of Thunder, he was courted by Disco Inferno and the Filthy Animals. Some random guy backstage. Of course you want him to join your group. He accompanied Rey Mysterio and Juventud Guerrero to the ring for a match against Sean O'Haire and Mark Jindrak, and then Sanders, of course, turned on them and joined up with Jindrak, O'Haire, Palumbo, Stasiak, and Reno, and believe me, I'll get to Reno. On the August 21st episode of Nitro, they named the group the Natural Born Thrillers. This literally, I'm watching WCW 2000 like I mentioned before. I'm watching this right now, and I'm around August. I'm around when they started. This literally comes out of nowhere. There's a Thunder, and then there's a Nitro, and then there's a Thunder where he does this thing, and then Monday they create the group, and that's it. It's just out of nowhere. A couple of the guys, but then the rest of them, they just come out of nowhere. The group was formed as the Natural Born Thrillers. Sanders, who was a better on the mic than pretty much all of them, became the mouthpiece. September 27th, he named himself the new WCW commissioner. Again, I know everyone got a chance at being commissioner or being in charge on screen, but I didn't know you could just declare it, but apparently you can, because why not? He later won the Cruiserweight title. Like I said, he was the talker of the group. He was okay in the ring, I guess, for a rookie who hadn't been in the business much. His nickname I didn't write. I remember Jericho said something. Chris Jericho did something on the podcast when they were talking about like dumb nicknames. And yeah, his nickname was above average. Not stupendous, not superstar, not amazing, not awesome. He was above average. It's just weird to me. He did the over the backbreaker thing where he grabs the guy's head and turns over his own back and drops him like Randy Orton does. He called it the 3.0 because that's a solid B. Nice little piece of trivia there. First time I ever saw that move done was by Mike Sanders before Randy Orton did it. WCW was sold, of course, and he, like many other people on the lower rung, were sent to HWA. And for a while, Raven talked about this, he actually helped Raven write their local TV show. And then in March 2002, he became the head booker of HWA, Heartland Wrestling Alliance. Nothing happened in his career after that. He did some indie work, had some runs with TNA, Vince Russo's Ring of Glory promotion. I'm sure that was just a laugh riot. And then since then, he left the wrestling business. He's now a stand-up comedian, improv actor, and motivational speaker. He's a good talker, so that's a good place for him. I've never seen his stand-up, I've never seen his improv, but he's been doing it for a long time now, so I assume he's doing pretty well. Remember when I said I was going to talk about Reno? Well, now is then, if that makes any sense. Reno is a professional kickboxer who trained at the power plant. Pretty easy background. He came into the Natural Born Thrillers and his gimmick was a martial artist. I remember he wore these white pants with like a black thing around the crotch, like the trunks. I don't even know how to explain it. He would win the hardcore belt. He was sort of the group's heavy. He was a bald guy with a ponytail, which is always like, I'm not even talking like Paul Heyman like pulling what remaining hair he has into a ponytail. I mean like he had no hair and then just a ponytail in the back. It looked kind of weird, but he was also like a tough guy, so you didn't really say nothing about it. He feuded with Big Vito because in storyline, Reno was dating Vito's storyline sister, but then later it was revealed that Reno and Big Vito themselves were brothers, which means he was dating his sister. Wait, what? WCW was sold, like I said. Reno's contract was up by WWF. He was sent to HWA and was released in 2001. Did some time with the ill-fated World Wrestling All-Stars and then retired in 2003, presumably to go back to kickboxing, but I can't really find any information on that. He was the kind of guy who came in at the tail end of WCW, was in this angle, and then just sort of faded away. So, I mean, there's really not a whole lot I know about the guy beyond this very short period in his life. Then there's Johnny the Bull. Johnny the Bull is very interesting. I found this out. Johnny the Bull was stabbed 6 times before he started training to be a pro wrestler. Most people have to at least wrestle New Jack to do that. He would come into WCW as part of the Mamalukes with Big Vito and Tony Marinara. You know, it's a family name. First is the guys who were trying to break the kneecaps of Disco, and then eventually they were managed by Disco because reasons. Johnny the Bull would betray Big Vito to join the Natural Born Thrillers, and then when the team itself, the Natural Born Thrillers itself, broke up in early 2001, he would make up with Big Vito, and this was sort of where they were at as a tag team. They were a tag team again right up to the time where WCW was sold. Johnny the Bull, say it with me, was sent to HWA, and not a whole lot. Years later, he returned to the WWE as Johnny the Bull Stamboli, eventually part of the Full Blood Italians with Chuck Palumbo and Nunzio. Full circle. He's released from WWE in November of 2004, and then he went to wear a meathead Italian gimmick to assure to get over. Japan. Actually went to All Japan and played an admittedly fake Great Muta. In January 2005, he dropped this and started the Voodoo Murder Stable with Taru. The Voodoo Murder Stable with Taru. Yes, I said Voodoo Murders. Shut up! He would later create a character that was completely departure from the Johnny Stamboli Italian character called Red Rum, and he would end up in TNA where they would rename him Relic. Relic, of course, is killer spelled backwards, something Mike Tenay had to remind you of every single match. And now, years later, he's still wrestling as both Red Rum and Johnny Stamboli. So that's very interesting. One of the only guys in this list that are still actually wrestling. Mark Jindrak is one of the most interesting characters in all of this. And I'm going to mention, there's only 2 more, but Mark Jindrak is one of the more interesting characters in this. Again, a power plant trainee. At one point, he was given a basketball gimmick because he played basketball in college. Like, they literally had him wear the shorts and the jersey and the thing, and it looked stupid. And then, you know, the first time they actually gave him a real push, he teamed with Sean OHair. And I remember famously, Sean OHair would wear the blue trunks for these biker shorts type thing, and Jindrak would wear red. And of course, this is where the double switch happened, where he teamed with OHair, and Palumbo and Stasiak were a team, and then eventually Palumbo and OHair ended up as a team, and Stasiak and Jindrak ended up a team. WCW sold, HWA, but Jindrak was later sent to Ohio Valley Wrestling, and he would pick up occasional wins on Sunday Night Heat on WWE programming, which is pretty cool. He got called up to the main roster and was actually considered at one point to be the 4th man in Evolution alongside Randy Orton, Triple H, and Ric Flair, going as far as taping the famous Evolution interest video with Jindrak. There's actually footage of him in the video walking from the helicopter, things like that, for reasons that have never been explained to this day. It's sort of this vague, like, oh, he wasn't mature enough, or blah, 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 blah. No one's really explained it, but he was removed from the group and replaced with Batista before it actually debuted. Don't know. Jindrak would later team with Garrison Cade, aka Lance Cade, in a rather decent babyface tag team that was, of course, like every other tag team, broken up because of the draft. He was drafted to SmackDown and was called the Reflection of Perfection, Mark Jindrak, because someone thought Perfection was done because it didn't rhyme. He was part of Kurt Angle's squad for a bit with the other legendary Reigns, Luther, but that didn't last. He jobbed for a while, was drafted to Raw, but was released in 2005 before he could return to Raw. So, went to Japan, worked for New Japan as a well-traveled jobber, and Hustle as Sodom, with Matt Morgan playing Gamora. What? In 2006, he debuted in CMLL as Marco Corleone, an Italian gimmick so blatant the estate of Marlon Brando should consider suing. He moved around from CMLL to AAA to Perros del Mal, and even appeared on Lucha Libre USA, that program that lasted about a year, before returning to CMLL. His last match to date was in March of 2018, though he is not officially retired from wrestling. So now we're talking about a guy who went from WCW, a guy who had a decent amount of success in WCW, a decent amount of success in WB, never a top guy. Of course, the Evolution spot would have put him in a higher realm, of course. I mean, everyone who came out of that group would end up being a top guy. And it's not, they weren't a top guy because they were in the group, but they were in the group and they were talented and they were able to show they were talented, and that led them to being a top guy. So could that have happened for Mark Jindrak? I don't know. It's hard to say. All I know is he lives in Mexico. He married a fashion designer in Mexico. He, up until March 2018, worked in Mexico wrestling, and he loved it, and he was doing very well for himself, so he did okay. But you got to think about, if he was that fourth man instead of Batista, would his career have gone a different path? I don't know, but it's fun to speculate as a wrestling fan. The final member I want to talk about in the group, the seventh man in the team, was a guy named Sean OHair. Sean OHair, of course, like I said, the rest of them, trained at the power plant, debuted in June of 2000, teaming with Mark Jindrak. That was how they first started out before the groups even formed. These two were a tag team. He would win the tag team titles with Chuck Palumbo, and they would be the last official WCW tag team champions under the old management. They would debut in WWE television by attacking the Hardy Boys of all people, and then later lose the WCW tag team titles to the Brothers of Destruction. OHair would then be sent down to OVW to work on his abilities. In January of 2003, OHair showed up in vignettes doing the new Devil's Advocate gimmick, where he acted like the little devil on people's shoulders, convincing them to do otherwise immoral things, like steal, commit adultery, lie, things like that. Basically, he's Eddie Guerrero without the charisma. When he actually debuted, they'd have him convince people to do odd things, like Brian Spanky Kendrick streak through SmackDown, something that fans of modern SmackDown would probably kill for. At least it'd be exciting. In the biggest push of his career, he was put with Roddy Piper, being his muscle, his bodyguard of sorts. After Piper was released due to a very controversial interview, OHair's push was killed as a result. He was later sent back down to OVW and then released in April of 2004. After some indie work that included a stint in UPW, OHair retired in 2005 to focus on a mixed martial arts career. In October of 2006, OHair did what a few pro wrestlers have actually done: get beat up by Butterbean. OHair got punched by Mr. Bean 4 to 5 times in under 30 seconds straight in the face to end his fight at Pride 32. He then would proceed to have a better record of beating his girlfriends than actual MMA opponents, and has the arrest record to prove it. The guy would go in through rehab up and down, and I'm not making light of this. It's sad to say, but it's true. He was in rehab a few times, and unfortunately, in September of 2014, Sean OHair committed suicide in the home he shared with his father. He was 43 years old. Leave it to me to pick the most depressing one to end on when we're talking about the Natural Born Thrillers. Wow, I've done a great job. Anyway, so when we're talking about this thing, as we're shifting gears, what is the significance of this group? In the long history of wrestling, it'll never be like DX. It'll never be like the Four Horsemen. It'll never be like the NWO. The Natural Born Thrillers was a very particular group. Like I said with the Magnificent Seven in a previous episode, it was a very simple snapshot of where wrestling was at the time, where WCW was at the time. But if you look at all the guys, you look at the 7 guys who are in that group, how many of them are still in the business? And how many of them are still in the business at such a high level? Really none of them. I mean, the most successful one of them has been Jindrak. doing the Marco Corleone character in Mexico. Johnny the Bull still wrestles. I mean, he wrestles, as these two different characters, but not really much anymore, and he hasn't really been on a national program since he was Relic on TNA, and that was at least 10 years ago. But at this time, when this little snapshot of what WCW was going through and how they were sort of winding up the promotion itself, and had these young guys who were coming in who made a very brief yet powerful impact in such a short period of time. I think it's very interesting to see how this all came to be, how it came so quickly, became such a big angle in the company, and then sort of faded away. During that time, it wasn't really that significant, but during that time, for a brief period, they were actually coached by Kevin Nash, who I'm sure taught them to show up when they felt like it, cash their checks, and make inside references that no one else understood. But outside of a few weeks of them doing sketches and declaring title victories nonsense, I don't know, they would declare a title victory didn't happen, or they would declare 4 guys the tag team champions, or something crazy like that. Outside of those few weeks where Kevin Nash was sort of having fun on TV and getting paid millions of dollars to do it, he didn't really mean a whole lot to the group. But the group itself, it was interesting. And of course, you'd see later on with things like the Nexus, where you saw another group of rookies done differently. And I would argue, as WCW was falling apart, as WCW was complete and utter chaos near the end, I would argue, and I will defend this, I would argue that the Natural Born Thrillers, as a group of young rookies being promoted to the main roster right away over a lot of other talented and established talents, for that group, I think they, in the short time they had, I think they did better with what they had than the original Nexus. The original Nexus, honestly, only had a couple of weeks before they were superseded and then just made irrelevant. So I would argue that the Natural Born Thrillers actually did that better than the WWE Machine did with the Nexus 10 years later. But that's my opinion. Well, that's going to do it for this time. If you have a topic you want to talk about, you have an idea that you want to hear me talk about, ramble on for a half hour or so, comment below the video, send me a message, talk to me personally, do whatever you got to do, smoke signals, beepers if those still work, text me, do what you got to do, like us on Facebook, Stitcher, Podbean, iTunes, whatever, we are there. Wherever you're listening right now, thank you for being around, thank you for listening, and until next time, my name's Dan, this is Exploder, have a good one.